Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this shadowed corner of history. Before we descend into the haunting depths of medieval darkness, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled beneath the covers, ready to drift off into dreams, or simply seeking to unwind with tales from history's forgotten corners, I'm grateful you've chosen to join me tonight. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what draws you to these ancient mysteries. Feel free to leave a comment below and let me know. It's always fascinating to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from across the globe. And if you are captivated by this style of immersive historical storytelling, please click that subscribe button. We have so many more dark chapters of the past waiting to be explored together. But for now, let the noise of the modern world fade away as we journey back to an age of crusading knights, sacred oaths, and terrible secrets. A time when men willingly surrendered their souls to serve a cause greater than themselves, only to discover that their sacrifice would lead not to salvation, but to a nightmare beyond their darkest fears. Picture yourself in the year 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade. The Holy Land has been wrested from Muslim control, but barely. Jerusalem, that most sacred of cities, lies vulnerable and exposed. Christian pilgrims journey across hostile territory, prey to bandits and raiders who show no mercy. It is in this crucible of violence and desperation that a new order of warrior monks is born, an order that would become the most powerful, most feared, and most secretive military force of the medieval world. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would know them as the Knights Templar. But tonight, we will not speak of their glory, their victories, or their legendary wealth. No, tonight we delve into the shadows of their existence. Tonight we explore what it truly meant to take the Templar oath, to live bound by rules that would break lesser men, to fight endless wars for an ungrateful church, and ultimately to watch helplessly as the very powers they had served turned against them with unimaginable brutality. This is the story of men who gave up everything for God, only to discover that God's earthly representatives had far darker plans in store. What does it mean to swear an oath of silence to a secretive order? What happens when a man willingly surrenders his voice, his freedom, and his very soul to serve a cause shrouded in mystery? Imagine yourself standing in the cold stone halls of a Templar commandery. The air is thick with incense and the weight of centuries of prayer. Before you stands a figure draped in the distinctive white robes of the order, the red cross blazoned across his chest like a wound that never heals. His face is hidden beneath his hood, but his voice cuts through the silence with words that will forever change your life. Do you wish to join the company of the house and participate in the spiritual and temporal benefits of the order? These were the words that began every Templar initiation. Simple words, innocent words, but behind them lay a labyrinth of secrets that would consume a man's entire existence. Brother Geoffrey de Charny knelt in that very position one autumn night in 1240. A young knight from Burgundy, he had come to the Holy Land filled with dreams of glory and service to Christ. He had heard tales of the Templars' prowess in battle, their unwavering faith, their sacred mission to protect Christian pilgrims. What he had not heard were the whispers of what truly went on behind the closed doors of Templar houses. The initiation ceremony began at midnight, as all Templar rituals did. Geoffrey was led into a chamber deep within the commandery, a room that had been blessed and consecrated, but somehow felt heavy with an oppressive darkness that no amount of holy water could cleanse. Around him stood a circle of Templars, their faces obscured by shadow and hood. The only light came from a single candle placed before a wooden cross. "Swear," commanded the preceptor, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "that you will reveal nothing of what transpires within these walls. Not to priest, not to pope, not to king. The secrets of the order are sacred and eternal. They are bought with blood and sealed with silence." Geoffrey placed his hand upon a Bible and spoke the words that would bind him forever. "I swear by God and by the Blessed Virgin Mary, by the blessed saints, and by this holy book, that I will never reveal the secrets of the order, no matter what torment may be visited upon me." He could not have known that he was sealing his own doom with those words. The oath of silence was more than a simple vow of discretion. It was a spiritual and psychological prison that isolated every Templar from the outside world. Once sworn, a knight could speak to no one outside the order about the true nature of their rituals, their finances, their military strategies, or their internal governance. They became men apart, bound together by secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. But what secrets were so terrible that they required such absolute silence? The truth is that many of the Templar secrets were simply practical matters of military and financial security. Their banking operations, which had made them the richest organization in medieval Europe, required absolute discretion. Their military tactics and intelligence networks needed protection from enemy spies. Their political alliances and diplomatic activities had to be shielded from rivals who would use any information against them. Yet the very act of swearing such absolute silence created an atmosphere of mystery and suspicion that would ultimately destroy them. When men spoke only to each other, when their rituals were conducted behind locked doors, when they refused to answer questions even from legitimate church authorities. Rumors began to spread, and in the medieval world, rumors could be as deadly as any sword. For Geoffrey and his brothers, the daily reality of the silence was crushing. Imagine being unable to share your fears with anyone outside your order. Imagine carrying the weight of terrible experiences in battle, of watching friends die horribly, of committing acts of violence that haunted your dreams, and having no one to confess to except the very men who had ordered you to commit those acts. The Templars had their own priests, their own confessors, their own internal hierarchy of spiritual guidance. But what happened when the source of your spiritual distress was the order itself? What happened when you began to question whether the path you had chosen truly led to salvation? Brother Marcus de Montfort, who served in the Holy Land for 12 years, later described the psychological torment of the silence and testimony that would be used against the order during their trials. "We lived as men condemned," he said, "unable to speak of our burdens to those who might offer comfort, forbidden from seeking guidance from outside our walls. The silence ate at us like a cancer, turning brothers against brothers, creating suspicions where there should have been trust. The silence also created a breeding ground for the very heresies that the order would later be accused of practicing. When men are isolated from mainstream religious teaching, when they develop their own internal interpretations of scripture and ritual, when they begin to see themselves as a people apart with special knowledge and special privileges, dangerous ideas can take root. Some historians believe that certain Templar houses did indeed develop unorthodox religious practices. Not the devil worship and blasphemy they would later be accused of, but rather a form of mystical Christianity that emphasized direct spiritual experience over church doctrine. This may have included meditation practices borrowed from Islamic mystics they encountered in the Holy Land, alternative interpretations of Christian symbolism, and rituals designed to create intense spiritual experiences through physical and emotional stress. Whether these practices were truly heretical or simply misunderstood adaptations of legitimate Christian mysticism would become a matter of life and death for thousands of Templars. The psychological pressure of maintaining absolute silence took different forms in different men. Some, like Geoffrey, threw themselves even deeper into religious observance, hoping that perfect obedience would silence their doubts. They attended every prayer service, memorized every word of the rule, and pushed themselves to physical and spiritual extremes in pursuit of the certainty that seemed to elude them. Others became suspicious and paranoid, seeing potential betrayers in every shadow. They reported on their brother's minor infractions, hoping to demonstrate their own loyalty while deflecting attention from their own doubts. These informants created an atmosphere of constant surveillance within Templar houses that made genuine brotherhood nearly impossible. Still others retreated into themselves, becoming isolated even within their isolated community. They performed their duties mechanically, spoke only when required, and lived in a state of emotional numbness that protected them from the full weight of their situation, but also cut them off from any possibility of joy or genuine spiritual connection. The most dangerous reaction was rebellion. Some knights, unable to bear the weight of their oath, began to actively resist the order's authority. They questioned orders, challenged superiors, and in some cases attempted to break their vows and flee. These men were dealt with swiftly and brutally, often disappearing in the night with no explanation given to their brothers. Brother Thomas de Chalon, who joined the order in 1250, later testified that he had witnessed the execution of 3 knights who had attempted to leave the order. They were taken in the night, he said, and when we asked what had become of them, we were told they had been transferred to other commanderies. But we found their possessions buried in the garden, and we knew the truth. The order tolerated no betrayal, no weakness, no doubt. The silence also prevented the Templars from defending themselves against the accusations that would eventually destroy them. When rumors began to spread about their secret rituals, their alleged blasphemies, their supposed consorting with demons, they were unable to simply open their doors and prove their innocence. Their own oath of silence had become a trap that prevented them from refuting even the most outrageous charges. King Philip IV of France, who orchestrated the order's destruction, understood this perfectly. He knew that an organization that had spent 2 centuries insisting on absolute secrecy could not suddenly claim transparency when it suited their purposes. Their silence, which had protected them for so long, became the very weapon that their enemies used against them. For the individual knights, the final cruel irony was that their oath of silence remained binding, even in the face of torture and death. When the arrest began in 1307, many Templars went to their graves without revealing the secrets that might have saved their lives, simply because they were true to vows they had sworn decades earlier. Geoffrey de Charny, the young knight who had knelt in that shadowed chamber in 1240, would die at the stake in 1314, still bound by an oath of silence that had transformed his life into a living nightmare. His last words, witnessed by dozens, were not confessions of guilt or pleas for mercy. They were a reaffirmation of his innocence and his loyalty to an order that had already been destroyed. "I have told the truth," he said as the flames rose around him. "God knows what we have suffered for nothing." The silence that was meant to protect the Templars had become their tomb. What was it like to fight in endless battles, always at the service of the Church? What was the true cost of their unceasing wars? Brother William de Sonnac stood on the blood-soaked walls of Gaza in the sweltering heat of a Palestinian summer, his white surcoat stained crimson from wounds that refused to heal. Around him, the moans of dying men mingled with the buzz of flies that had grown fat on Christian and Muslim blood alike. This was his 20th year of continuous warfare in the Holy Land, and he could no longer remember what peace felt like. He was not yet 30 years old, but his body bore the accumulated damage of 2 decades of combat. His left arm had been broken so many times that it no longer straightened completely. His back was crisscrossed with scars from sword cuts and arrow wounds that had nearly killed him. His right eye was clouded with blindness from a mace blow that had shattered his helmet and part of his skull. Yet here he stood, ready to fight again, because the order demanded it, and he knew no other life. This was the reality for Templar Knights, not glorious crusades with clear victories and noble purposes, but an endless, grinding warfare that consumed men's bodies and souls with mechanical precision. The Templar rule was brutally clear about their military obligations. As soon as the call to arms is heard in the camp, it stated, no brother should ask what enemy he is about to encounter or what number they are, but should arm himself at once and follow the banner wherever it may lead, even unto death. Even unto death. Those 3 words define the entire Templar existence. From the moment a man took the Templar vows, his life was no longer his own. He became a weapon in the hands of the Church, to be drawn whenever needed, wielded without mercy, and discarded when broken. The psychological impact of this total surrender of personal agency cannot be overstated. These men had volunteered to become instruments of violence, and the order made sure they never forgot it. Brother Jacques de Vitry, who served as chaplain to a Templar regiment, recorded in his chronicles the daily routine that transformed free men into perfect soldiers. They rose before dawn for prayers, he wrote, but the words they spoke were not supplications for peace or forgiveness. They prayed for strength to kill, for courage to die, for the wisdom to know when violence served God's will. They had made war their prayer and death their sacrament. The training began immediately upon taking vows and never truly ended. Unlike secular knights who might train periodically and fight seasonally, Templars maintained constant combat readiness. Every day included hours of weapons practice, physical conditioning, and tactical drills. This wasn't preparation for occasional campaigns. This was preparation for a lifetime of warfare. But the physical training was only part of their conditioning. The order systematically broke down their humanity and rebuilt them as instruments of divine violence. They were taught to see enemy soldiers not as men with families and fears, but as obstacles to God's will. They learned to kill efficiently, without emotion, without hesitation, without remorse. Brother Hugh de Payens, one of the order's founders, wrote explicitly about this dehumanization process in letters that survived the order's destruction. "A knight who hesitates to strike is already dead," he wrote. "A knight who feels pity for his enemy has forgotten his duty to God. We must become as angels of death, pure in our purpose, terrible in our righteousness." The psychological toll of this constant readiness for violence was enormous. Men who had been raised in Christian societies that taught forgiveness and mercy were systematically trained to abandon those values in service of their military mission. The cognitive dissonance between their Christian faith and their violent profession created internal conflicts that many never resolved. Brother Robert de Sablé, who fought in the Siege of Acre, later described the mental breakdown that many Templars experienced. "We saw brothers who had been devout and gentle become beasts in battle," he testified. "Men who wept at the crucifixion story would laugh while cutting down children during the storming of cities. The order made us into monsters and then condemned us when we became what they had trained us to be." The military campaigns themselves were exercises in calculated brutality. Templars were expected to show no quarter to enemies, to kill wounded soldiers rather than take prisoners, to execute captives when it was militarily convenient. These weren't occasional wartime atrocities. They were standard operating procedures encoded in the order's rule and enforced through discipline. During the Siege of Damascus in 1248, Templar Knights under the command of Brother William de Sonnac systematically executed over 300 Muslim prisoners because they lacked the resources to feed them during the march to their next objective. The Knights performed these executions methodically, one by one, while reciting prayers for the salvation of their own souls. The psychological impact on the executioners was considered irrelevant compared to the military necessity of the action. This combination of religious devotion and systematic violence created a unique form of moral injury that had no precedent in medieval warfare. Secular soldiers could rationalize their violence as necessary for survival or advancement. Templars had to reconcile their violence with their identity as servants of a loving God. Many never managed this reconciliation and lived in a state of constant spiritual crisis. The order's response to this moral injury was to intensify both religious observance and military training. Knights who showed signs of psychological distress were subjected to increased prayer requirements, more demanding physical conditioning, and assignment to even more dangerous combat roles. The theory was that spiritual weakness could be overcome through spiritual discipline, and that fear could be conquered through exposure to greater dangers. In practice, this approach often accelerated the psychological breakdown it was meant to prevent. Brother Matthew Paris, a contemporary chronicler, recorded numerous instances of Templars who went mad from the strain of their dual obligations. "They would be found in the morning," he wrote, "having spent the night in fervent prayer, only to spend the day in frenzied slaughter. Some talked to visions of Christ while covered in blood. Others confessed their sins while sharpening their weapons. The line between devotion and madness became impossible to distinguish." The most disturbing aspect of Templar military culture was its systematic elimination of human connections that might interfere with military effectiveness. Knights were forbidden from forming close friendships, discouraged from maintaining correspondence with family members, and prevented from developing emotional attachments that might make them hesitate in battle. This isolation was enforced through constant rotation between different Templar houses and deliberate assignment of knights to units where they knew no one. The order understood that men fight differently when they're surrounded by strangers versus friends. Strangers could be sacrificed more easily, and their deaths would not create the emotional trauma that might impair future military effectiveness. Brother Gerard de Riedfort, who served as Grand Master during some of the order's bloodiest campaigns, wrote candidly about this policy in internal documents. "A knight who loves his brothers will hesitate to order their deaths," he explained. A knight who has no brothers will do whatever victory requires. We must be family to each other in prayer and strangers to each other in battle. The physical demands of constant warfare took their own toll. Unlike modern soldiers who rotate between combat and non-combat roles, Templars were expected to remain in active military service until they were physically incapable of fighting. There was no retirement, no peaceful old age, no gentle transition to civilian life. Brother James de Molay, who would become the Order's last Grand Master, spent over 40 years in continuous military service. By the time of his arrest in 1307, his medical examination revealed injuries that would have been considered disabling for any other person. Multiple bone fractures that had healed improperly, muscle damage from repeated sword cuts, joint problems from wearing heavy armor for decades, and neurological damage from repeated head trauma. Yet he was still considered fit for combat duty because he could still hold a sword and sit on a horse. The Order had no category for partially disabled. Knights, you were either capable of fighting or you were dead. The financial costs of maintaining a permanent military force were staggering, and much of this burden fell on the individual knights themselves. Despite their vows of poverty, Templars were expected to maintain their own equipment, horses, and weapons to professional standards. This created a constant tension between their spiritual ideals and their practical military needs. A knight's equipment represented a massive investment that had to be replaced regularly. Swords wore out from use and required expensive maintenance. Armor was damaged in battle and needed constant repair. Horses were killed or injured and had to be replaced. The Order provided basic subsistence, but knights were expected to use their own resources or family wealth to maintain their military effectiveness. This financial pressure created additional psychological stress for men who had taken vows of poverty but found themselves constantly worried about money. Many Templars accumulated debt trying to maintain their equipment, then faced discipline from the Order for failing to meet financial obligations. The contradiction between their spiritual vows and their practical needs was never resolved and created ongoing internal conflict. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of Templar military service was its ultimate futility. Despite 2 centuries of continuous warfare, despite thousands of knights killed and wounded, despite enormous financial investments and political sacrifices, the Holy Land was gradually lost to Muslim forces. By 1291, when Acre fell to Mamluk forces, it was clear that the entire Crusader project had failed. The Templars had given everything, their lives, their souls, their humanity, for a cause that was ultimately hopeless. The psychological impact of this realization on surviving knights was catastrophic. Brother Geoffrey de Charnay, writing shortly before his execution, captured this despair in a letter to his sister. "We have spent our lives in service to a lie," he wrote. "We were told that God wanted us to hold the Holy Land, but God has allowed it to fall. We were told that our sacrifices would earn salvation, but our violence has only brought damnation. We are warriors without a war, monks without a monastery, men without a purpose." The final bitter irony was that when the Order was finally destroyed, it was not by military defeat but by political persecution. All their training, all their fighting, all their sacrifices had prepared them for honorable death in battle. Instead, they died in torture chambers and at execution stakes, victims of the very political forces they had served so faithfully. The last Templar garrison in the Holy Land surrendered not to superior military force, but to the simple reality that there was no longer any reason to fight. The war was over, the cause was lost, and the Order itself was about to disappear into history. For the men who had given their entire lives to military service, this ending was perhaps more devastating than any battlefield defeat could have been. What happens when the very power you've sworn to protect turns on you? How did the fear of betrayal shape their daily existence? Brother Renaud de Vichier pressed his ear against the cold stone wall of his cell in the Temple's Paris headquarters, straining to hear the whispered conversations that might reveal which of his brothers had broken under torture. It was March 1308, 4 months after the arrest that had shattered the Order, and every day brought new revelations about who could be trusted and who had betrayed their oath of silence. The footsteps in the corridor had become a symphony of fear. Heavy boots meant guards approaching with new victims for interrogation. Light sandals meant brothers being led to confession. The shuffle of chains meant someone was being transferred. either to freedom for cooperating or to a darker cell for refusing to confess. Renaud had learned to interpret these sounds like a musician reading notes, because his life might depend on knowing what they meant. In the adjacent cell, Brother Philip Devote had been weeping for 3 days straight. Philip had been among the first to confess to heretical practices, claiming that the order had forced him to deny Christ, spit on the cross, and worship a demonic head called Baphomet. Whether these confessions were true or extracted through torture was impossible to know, but Philip's tears suggested that breaking his oath of silence had not brought the peace he had expected. This was the nightmare that every Templar had lived with for decades, the knowledge that their own brothers might be turned against them, that the secrets they had sworn to protect could become weapons in the hands of their enemies, that their loyalty to each other and to the order could be systematically destroyed through pain and fear. The fear of betrayal had not begun with the arrests. It had been part of Templar life from the very beginning, woven into the structure of an organization that was simultaneously military, religious, and financial. When you create a group that operates in secret, accumulates vast wealth, and wields significant political power, you inevitably create enemies who will try to destroy you from within. Brother Marcus de Provence, who joined the order in 1275, later testified about the atmosphere of suspicion that pervaded Templar houses even during their years of greatest power. "We were taught that spies might be anywhere," he said, "among the servants, among the novices, even among the knights themselves. We learned to guard our words, to watch our brothers for signs of disloyalty, to report suspicious behavior to our superiors. We became a brotherhood united by distrust." This culture of surveillance served practical purposes. The Templars possessed detailed intelligence about political developments across Europe and the Holy Land. They maintained extensive networks of informants and agents. They conducted sensitive financial transactions that could influence the stability of kingdoms. Any breach of security could have catastrophic consequences for the order's mission and its members' safety. But the psychological cost was enormous. Men who had joined the order seeking spiritual brotherhood found themselves living in a community where genuine intimacy was impossible because it might be dangerous. Knights learned to share meals without sharing thoughts, to pray together without sharing doubts, to fight together without sharing fears. The order's internal justice system reflected this atmosphere of constant suspicion. The Templar rule included detailed procedures for investigating accusations of misconduct, procedures that assumed guilt until innocence was proven, and that rewarded informants who reported on their brother's behavior. Knights were explicitly instructed to monitor each other and report any violations of the rule, no matter how minor. Brother Thomas de Chalon, who served as a sergeant in the order's administrative hierarchy, described how this system worked in practice. "Every knight knew that his actions were being watched by multiple brothers," he testified. "Every word was heard by someone who might report it. Every friendship was suspect because it might indicate conspiracy. We lived as prisoners of our own making, trapped by a system of mutual surveillance that made trust impossible." The financial success of the order created additional layers of suspicion and potential betrayal. As the Templars became Europe's most important banking institution, they attracted the attention of debtors who preferred destruction to repayment. Kings and nobles who owed massive sums to the order had powerful incentives to find ways to escape their obligations, even if it meant fabricating charges against their creditors. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars approximately 1.3 million livres at the time of their arrest, a sum that represented roughly 10% of the French royal budget. Edward II of England owed them significant amounts as well. For these rulers, the destruction of the order was not just politically convenient, but financially necessary. The fear of betrayal by their own debtors was well-founded because the betrayal was already being planned. The Templars understood this danger and took extensive precautions to protect themselves from political attack. They maintained careful records of all financial transactions, created multiple copies of important documents, and distributed their wealth across numerous locations to prevent easy seizure. They cultivated relationships with church leaders who might protect them from secular persecution and maintain their own military forces to deter direct assault. But they failed to recognize how these very precautions made them appear more threatening to their potential enemies. their financial records, could be interpreted as evidence of excessive wealth and corruption. Their document security could be seen as suspicious secrecy. Their political relationships could be viewed as dangerous conspiracies. Their military preparations could be portrayed as evidence of treasonous intentions. Brother Geoffrey de Charnay, who served as preceptor of Normandy, wrote extensively about this paradox in letters to other Templar leaders. Every step we take to protect ourselves becomes evidence of our guilt in the eyes of those who wish us harm, he observed. Our caution is called paranoia. Our success is called greed. Our loyalty to each other is called conspiracy. We are trapped by the very virtues that made us strong. The most insidious aspect of the betrayal that eventually destroyed the order was how it exploited the Templars' own internal conflicts and resentments. Not every member of the order was satisfied with Templar policies or leadership. Some knights felt that the order had become too wealthy and political. Some believed that the military mission in the Holy Land was misguided. Some resented the strict discipline and harsh living conditions that Templar life required. These internal critics became perfect targets for enemy manipulation. Royal agents and church investigators sought out disaffected Templars and offered them various inducements to provide damaging testimony against the order. Some were promised pardons for their own alleged crimes. Others were offered financial rewards or positions in other organizations. Still others were simply told that cooperation was their only chance to avoid torture and execution. Brother Stephen de Troyes, who had served as a knight for 15 years before the arrests, later admitted that he had been approached by French agents months before the mass arrest began. They knew things about me, he testified, personal matters, financial difficulties, conflicts I had had with my superiors. They offered to solve my problems if I would help them understand what really went on in Templar houses. I thought I was providing harmless information to legitimate authorities. I did not realize I was helping to destroy my own brothers. The psychological warfare employed against the Templars was sophisticated and systematic. Interrogators used information provided by these early defectors to create the impression that they already knew everything about Templar activities. They confronted arrested knights with accurate details about their personal lives, their relationships, their private conversations, and their secret fears. This created the terrifying impression that the order had been thoroughly compromised, that everyone had already confessed, that resistance was futile because betrayal was universal. Many knights confessed not because they were guilty of the charges against them, but because they believed their resistance was pointless if their brothers had already revealed everything. Brother James de Malay, the Order's Grand Master, described this psychological manipulation in his final testimony before his execution. They told each of us that the others had already confessed, he said. They claimed to know details that only our brothers could have provided. They made us believe that we were the last holdouts against universal betrayal. Many confessed not to crimes they had committed, but to spare themselves the pain of believing they had been abandoned by everyone they trusted. The use of torture to extract confessions added another layer to the betrayal. The church had developed sophisticated techniques for causing pain without permanent damage, methods that could break a person's will without marking their body in ways that would invalidate their testimony. Knights who had survived decades of warfare found themselves unable to withstand psychological and physical pressures that were specifically designed to destroy human resistance. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the betrayal was how it turned the Templars' greatest strength, their loyalty to each other, into a weapon against them. Interrogators learned to threaten not just individual knights but their brothers. A knight who might endure any amount of personal suffering could be broken by threats against men he considered family. Brother William de Sonac, the veteran warrior who had survived 20 years of combat, finally confessed after being told that his refusal to cooperate was prolonging the torture of younger knights in his command. I could not watch boys I had trained suffer for my stubbornness, he later wrote. I confessed to lies to end their pain. In trying to protect them, I betrayed everything we had sworn to defend. The final bitter irony was that these confessions, extracted through manipulation and torture, were then used to justify the order's destruction. Men who had been loyal to their vows of silence for decades were painted as heretics and traitors based on statements they had made under duress. Their loyalty to each other, which had been turned against them, was then presented as evidence of conspiracy and corruption. The psychological damage to surviving Templars was catastrophic. Men who had built their entire identities around concepts of honor, loyalty, and sacred duty discovered that these very virtues had been systematically perverted and used to destroy them. Many never recovered from the realization that their greatest strengths had become their greatest vulnerabilities. Brother Geoffrey de Charnay, writing from his prison cell shortly before his execution, captured this devastation in words that still echo across the centuries. "They have not merely killed our bodies," he wrote. "They have murdered our souls. They have taken everything that made us who we were and turned it into evidence of what we were not. We die not as martyrs for our faith, but as victims of our own virtue." The fear of betrayal that had shaped Templar life for 2 centuries had finally been realized in the most complete and devastating way possible. The order that had survived military defeats, political persecution, and internal conflicts could not survive the systematic destruction of trust between brothers who had sworn to protect each other with their lives. In the end, the Templars were destroyed not by external enemies, but by the corruption of the bonds that had held them together. The betrayal that killed them came not from outside their walls, but from within their own hearts. When the Templars were accused of heresy and their sacred order was destroyed, what did it mean for the men who had given everything? Brother Jacques de Molay stood in the flickering torchlight of his cell in the Château de Chinon, his wrists raw from months of chains, his once proud frame bent by the weight of impossible choices. As the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, he had commanded the loyalty of thousands of knights across Europe and the Holy Land. Now, in the early hours of March 18, 1314, he was preparing to die for refusing to confess to crimes he had never committed. Through his small window, he could see the funeral pyre being constructed on the Ile de la Cité, its wooden framework rising like a twisted cathedral against the gray dawn sky. In a few hours, he and his companion, Geoffrey de Charnay, would burn alive, the final victims of a persecution that had already consumed their entire order. 7 years of imprisonment, torture, and legal proceedings had led to this moment, the complete annihilation of an organization that had survived 2 centuries of warfare, political intrigue, and religious persecution. The end had come not with the clash of swords or the thunder of cavalry charges, but with a knock on the door at dawn on October 13th, 1307. On that Friday morning, every Templar house in France was simultaneously raided by royal forces acting on sealed orders from King Philip IV. Knights who had gone to sleep as members of Christendom's most powerful military order awoke as prisoners accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Brother Robert de Saint-Just, who was arrested at the Paris Temple, later described the shock of that morning in testimony that would later be suppressed by church authorities. "We were awakened by the sound of armed men in our corridors," he said. "At first we thought we were under attack by enemies of the faith. We reached for our weapons, prepared to defend our house as we had been trained. Only when we saw the royal banners did we understand that our enemies were not infidels or bandits, but the very Christian king we had served faithfully for decades." The charges against the Templars were as shocking as they were comprehensive. They were accused of denying Christ during secret initiation ceremonies, spitting and urinating on crosses, worshiping a demonic idol called Baphomet, practicing homosexual acts as part of their religious observances, and conspiring against Christian rulers. Each accusation was carefully calculated to destroy not just their legal standing, but their psychological identity as Christian warriors. For men who had built their entire lives around service to Christ and the Church, these accusations were more devastating than any physical torture. Brother Marcus de Provence, who had spent 30 years as a knight, described the psychological impact in his confession. "They accused us of denying the very God we had died for, of spitting on the cross we had carried into battle, of worshiping demons while we prayed for salvation. To hear these words was worse than any wound I received in the Holy Land." The legal proceedings that followed were carefully orchestrated to ensure the order's destruction while maintaining the appearance of legitimate justice. King Philip had learned from previous failed attempts to destroy the Templars that direct political attack would not work. The order was too wealthy, too well-connected, and too powerful to be eliminated through conventional means. Only by attacking their religious legitimacy could he hope to succeed. The French legal system was modified specifically for the Templar trials. New procedures were introduced that allowed the use of torture to extract confessions, that accepted testimony from witnesses who would normally be considered unreliable, and that placed the burden of proof on the accused rather than their accusers. These changes ensured that conviction was virtually inevitable, regardless of the evidence. Brother William de Nogaret, who served as Philip's chief legal advisor, wrote candidly about these innovations in private correspondence that survived in royal archives. Traditional legal procedures would not suffice for this case, he explained. The Templars are too skilled at defending themselves through conventional means. We must create new methods that bypass their defenses and ensure the outcome we require. The use of torture was systematic and scientifically applied. Church authorities had developed detailed manuals describing the most effective techniques for breaking human resistance while keeping victims alive long enough to provide useful testimony. These methods were applied not randomly, but according to careful psychological profiles of individual knights. Young knights were subjected to different pressures than veterans. Knights with families were threatened with harm to their relatives. Knights with known health problems were tortured in ways that exacerbated their conditions. Knights who showed strong religious devotion were forced to commit acts of sacrilege. Each torture session was tailored to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of its victim. Brother Stephen de Troyes, who was among the first to confess under torture, later described the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed by his interrogators. They knew things about me that only my closest brothers could have known, he testified. They described my childhood fears, my personal doubts, my private shames. They convinced me that resistance was futile because they already possessed all knowledge about our order. The torture was merely confirmation of what they claimed to already know. The confessions extracted through these methods were then used to create a self-reinforcing cycle of apparent guilt. Each new confession was presented to subsequent prisoners as evidence that resistance was pointless because everyone else had already revealed the truth. Knights who might have endured any amount of personal suffering found themselves unable to maintain their denials when confronted with apparent testimony from their own brothers. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the persecution was how it corrupted the very relationships that had sustained the Templars through 2 centuries of hardship. The order's strength had always come from the bonds between brothers who trusted each other absolutely. The interrogation process systematically destroyed these bonds by creating uncertainty about who could be trusted and who had betrayed their oaths. Brother Geoffrey de Charnay, writing from prison to his sister, described this psychological destruction. "They have done something worse than kill us," he wrote. "They have made us doubt each other. We no longer know which of our brothers spoke truly under torture and which confessed to lies to end their pain. Every man looks at every other man and wonders, was it you who betrayed us? The brotherhood that was our strength has become our torment." The show trials that followed the interrogations were exercises in predetermined outcomes. Despite the extensive legal procedures, the careful recording of testimony, and the appearance of judicial process, the verdict had been decided before the trials began. The only remaining question was how many Templars would maintain their innocence to the end, and how many would accept the narrative of their guilt in exchange for lighter sentences. The majority of knights, broken by months or years of imprisonment and torture, eventually confessed to at least some of the charges against them. These confessions were then used to justify not just individual punishments, but the dissolution of the entire order. If individual Templars were guilty of heresy, the logic went, then the organization that had produced and protected them must be fundamentally corrupt. Brother James de Molay, the Grand Master, presented a particularly difficult problem for his persecutors. As the head of the order, his confession would carry enormous weight in justifying its destruction. Yet as a man who had spent his entire adult life building and leading the organization, he had the most to lose from admitting its corruption. Molay's treatment during his 7 years of imprisonment reveals the sophisticated psychological warfare employed against the order's leaders. He was kept in solitary confinement for extended periods, denied contact with other Templars who might support his resistance, and subjected to interrogation sessions that lasted for days without rest. When physical torture failed to break him, his captors employed more subtle forms of pressure. They arranged for him to witness the confessions of knights he had personally recruited and trained. They showed him documents detailing the suffering of Templars in prisons across Europe and suggested that his continued resistance was prolonging their agony. They brought him news of former friends and allies who had abandoned the order and accepted positions in other organizations. Each piece of information was carefully chosen to erode his psychological defenses. The most effective pressure came from spiritual manipulation. Malay's interrogators included learned theologians who argued that his resistance to lawful authority was itself a form of heresy, that his pride in maintaining innocence was preventing him from achieving the humility necessary for salvation, that his loyalty to the order was placing human bonds above divine commands. Brother Bernard de Clairvaux, one of the interrogating theologians, wrote detailed reports about these sessions that reveal the sophisticated theological arguments employed. We convinced him that confession would not be betrayal, but rather obedience to God's will as expressed through his earthly representatives, Bernard reported. We showed him that his suffering was meaningless unless it led to repentance, that his martyrdom would be suicide unless it served divine justice. Under this combined assault of physical, psychological, and spiritual pressure, Mole finally confessed in 1308 to charges that he had previously denied. His confession was immediately publicized across Europe as proof of the order's guilt and evidence that even its highest leaders acknowledged their crimes. Yet Mole's story did not end with his confession. After years of cooperation with his persecutors, something changed. Perhaps it was contact with other Templar leaders who had maintained their innocence. Perhaps it was reflection on the consequences of his confession for the thousands of knights who had trusted his leadership. Perhaps it was simply the realization that cooperation had brought him no closer to freedom or salvation. In March 1314, when he was brought before a papal commission to make his final confession before receiving sentence, Mole stunned his captors by retracting everything he had previously admitted. Standing before a crowd of officials, nobles, and common citizens, he declared that the confessions had been lies extracted through torture and intimidation, that the order was innocent of all charges, and that he would rather die than continue to bear false witness against his brothers. "I confess that I am guilty of the greatest infamy," he declared, "but the infamy is that I lied when I testified against my order to save my miserable life. The order is pure and holy. The accusations are false. I would rather die than continue to live with the shame of having betrayed the truth." His companion Geoffrey de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, made a similar declaration. Both men were immediately sentenced to death as relapsed heretics, people who had confessed their sins but then returned to their previous errors. The execution that followed was designed to serve as both punishment and public spectacle. The pyre was constructed on a small island in the Seine, where it could be seen from both banks of the river. The wood was arranged to burn slowly, ensuring that the condemned men would suffer for as long as possible while remaining conscious enough to provide entertainment for the watching crowds. Contemporary accounts describe crowds that included nobles, clergy, merchants, and common citizens who had come to witness the final destruction of the order that had once been among the most powerful institutions in Europe. Some came seeking entertainment. Others came hoping to see either defiant martyrdom or final confession from the order's leaders. Brother James de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were led to the pyre in chains, their bodies weakened by 7 years of imprisonment, but their voices still strong enough to carry their final words across the water to the watching crowds. According to multiple witnesses, including hostile chroniclers who had no reason to romanticize their deaths, both men maintained their innocence to the end. As the flames rose around them, they declared their faith in God, proclaimed the innocence of their order, and called upon divine justice to vindicate them against their persecutors. Malay's final words, recorded by multiple witnesses, became part of medieval legend. "God knows the truth of our innocence," he cried as the flames reached his robes. "The lies that have destroyed us will not endure. Before God and man, I declare that this order was pure and holy. Let those who have condemned us face divine judgment for their crimes against justice." The Grand Master died as he had lived for the final years of his life, as a prisoner whose crime had been loyalty to an organization that had become inconvenient for powerful men who owed it money and feared its independence. The psychological and spiritual destruction of the order was complete. The institution that had channeled the martial and religious energies of medieval Europe for 2 centuries was reduced to ash and memory. The men who had surrendered their individual lives to serve a collective mission discovered that collective identity could be destroyed as easily as individual bodies. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the order's end was how it vindicated all the fears and paranoia that had shaped Templar life for generations. Their assumption that they lived surrounded by enemies who would destroy them if given the opportunity proved absolutely correct. Their belief that their own loyalty and virtue could be turned against them was confirmed in the most complete way possible. The surviving Templars, those few who escaped death or life imprisonment, scattered across Europe carrying with them the knowledge that service to any cause greater than oneself was a form of vulnerability that could be exploited by those who served nothing but their own interests. The Knights Templar had learned too late that in a world where power mattered more than truth, loyalty was not a virtue but a weakness, and that the very dedication that made them strong also made them vulnerable to those who recognized no bonds except convenience and profit. What legacy did the Knights Templar leave behind? Their rise and fall may have been brutal, but the Templars left behind more than just a history of bloodshed. Brother Thomas de Chalon stood in the ruins of the Temple Church in London, his breath misting in the cold air of an English winter morning in 1315. The once magnificent round church, modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, now showed signs of systematic looting. Royal officials had stripped away anything of value, leaving behind only the stone effigies of Templar knights that were too heavy to steal and too sacred for even Henry II's men to destroy. Thomas was one of perhaps a dozen former Templars still alive in England, men who had been released after confessing to charges they had never committed, who now lived as pensioners of the crown, watched constantly for signs of attempting to revive their forbidden order. He had come to this place where he had once worshipped with his brothers to try to understand what, if anything, remained of the life they had built together. As he knelt among the stone knights, their carved faces serene in eternal prayer, Thomas realized that the Templars' true legacy would not be found in buildings or treasures, but in the ideas and fears they had planted in the minds of those who came after them. The order was dead, but the questions it raised about power, secrecy, loyalty, and betrayal would echo through the centuries. The immediate legacy of the Templars was one of trauma and suspicion that spread far beyond their own ranks. Every military order, every religious community, every organization that operated with any degree of independence or secrecy became suspect in the eyes of rulers who had learned from Philip IV's example. If the mighty Templars could be destroyed through fabricated charges and forced confessions, no institution was safe from similar treatment. The Hospitallers, the Templars' greatest rivals, immediately implemented new policies of transparency and royal cooperation to avoid similar persecution. They opened their books to royal inspection, submitted their military plans to crown approval, and actively collaborated with secular authorities in ways that would have been unthinkable before the Templar trials. The other great military order had learned that survival required the complete surrender of institutional independence. Brother William de Villeray, Grand Master of the Hospitallers, wrote extensively about these changes in letters to his subordinates. The fate of our brothers in the Temple has taught us that no service to God or church can protect an order that becomes inconvenient to earthly powers, he warned. We must make ourselves indispensable to kings while appearing unthreatening to their authority. Our strength must be their strength, our wealth must serve their purposes, our independence must be an illusion. But the Templar legacy extended far beyond the immediate impact on other religious orders. Their destruction had demonstrated new possibilities for the relationship between church and state, between individual conscience and institutional authority, between truth and power. Future rulers would remember the Templar trials as proof that any organization could be destroyed if the right combination of legal procedure, popular prejudice, and systematic torture was applied. The legal innovations created for the Templar trials became precedents that would be used against countless future victims. The use of torture to extract confessions, the acceptance of testimony from witnesses with obvious motives to lie, the reversal of the burden of proof to require defendants to prove their innocence rather than prosecutors to prove their guilt. All of these became standard features of European justice systems. More importantly, the trials established the principle that accusation of heresy could justify any violation of traditional legal protections. Once someone was labeled a heretic, normal rules of evidence, normal standards of proof, normal concepts of human rights ceased to apply. This precedent would be invoked repeatedly over the following centuries to justify persecution of minorities, dissidents, and anyone whose beliefs or practices challenged established authority. The psychological techniques developed for breaking Templar resistance were studied and refined by later interrogators. The combination of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and spiritual coercion proved so effective that it became the standard approach for dealing with religious and political prisoners. The Inquisition, in particular, adopted wholesale the methods that had been used against the Templars. Brother Bernard Gouy, who served as an inquisitor in the years following the Templar trials, wrote detailed manuals based on techniques that had been developed during the interrogations. "The Templars taught us that no human resistance is absolute," he explained. "Every man has breaking points that can be discovered and exploited. The key is understanding what each individual values more than his own life, then threatening or corrupting those values until compliance becomes preferable to continued resistance." The financial legacy of the Templars was equally significant. Their banking innovations, letters of credit, international money transfers, interest-bearing loans disguised as currency exchanges, survived their destruction and became the foundation of European commercial development. The techniques they had developed for managing vast sums across multiple jurisdictions were adopted by Italian banking houses that would dominate European finance for centuries. But perhaps more importantly, their destruction demonstrated the vulnerabilities of international financial institutions to political pressure. Future bankers would learn that no amount of wealth could protect them if they became too powerful or too independent. The Medici family in particular structured their operations to avoid the concentration of power and the appearance of autonomy that had made the Templars such attractive targets. Lorenzo de' Medici, writing in 1478, explicitly referenced the Templar example in instructions to his bank managers. "Remember always that our prosperity depends on our usefulness to princes, not our independence from them," he warned. "The moment we appear to threaten their authority or question their decisions, we become expendable regardless of our wealth or our services." The Templars forgot this lesson and paid the ultimate price. The military legacy of the Templars was more complex. Their innovations in castle design, siege warfare, and battlefield tactics were studied and copied by later military leaders. Their emphasis on discipline, training, and professional military service influenced the development of standing armies across Europe. Their integration of different military specialties, heavy cavalry, infantry, engineers, intelligence operatives, became the model for combined arms operations. Yet their ultimate military failure in the Holy Land also provided lessons about the limitations of military force in achieving political objectives. The Crusader states had been lost not because of military defeat in any single battle, but because the local population never accepted Christian rule, and because European support for the enterprise eventually waned. Future military leaders would study the Crusades as an example of how tactical success could lead to strategic failure if broader political and cultural factors were ignored. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Templars proved to be their most enduring contribution to European civilization. Their libraries, scattered during their persecution, preserved and transmitted texts that might otherwise have been lost. Their contacts with Islamic scholars had introduced European intellectuals to Arabic translations of Greek philosophy, to advances in mathematics and astronomy, to new approaches to medicine and engineering. Brother Gérard de Riedfort, who had served as the order's librarian in Paris, managed to smuggle hundreds of manuscripts out of France during the arrests. These books, hidden in friendly monasteries and noble houses, eventually found their way into the collections of later scholars who would launch the intellectual renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries. More significantly, the Templar experience with other cultures and religions had planted seeds of intellectual curiosity and religious questioning that would eventually bloom into more systematic challenges to church authority. Knights who had lived in the Holy Land for decades, who had worked alongside Muslim and Jewish scholars, who had seen the practical benefits of tolerance and cooperation, brought these experiences back to Europe in ways that gradually undermined the intellectual foundations of medieval Christian exclusivity. Brother Marcus de Provence, who spent his final years in a Benedictine monastery after confessing to save his life, wrote secretly about these experiences in manuscripts that would not be discovered until the 16th century. In the Holy Land, we learned that wisdom was not the exclusive possession of Christians, he observed. We saw Muslim physicians heal Christian patients, Jewish scholars solve Christian intellectual problems, Islamic architects build Christian churches. These experiences taught us that God's truth might be larger than any single human understanding of it. The symbolic legacy of the Templars became perhaps their most powerful contribution to later European culture. The image of the crusading knight, pure in purpose but corrupted by power, innocent in intention but guilty in practice, became a recurring theme in literature, art, and political thought. The Templars represented both the highest aspirations of medieval Christianity and its most devastating failures. This symbolic power was enhanced by the mysterious circumstances of their destruction and the dramatic nature of their final persecution. Unlike other military orders that simply faded away or were absorbed into different institutions, the Templars vanished suddenly and completely, leaving behind only ruins, legends, and unanswered questions. This dramatic ending made them perfect subjects for romantic speculation and conspiracy theories that would persist for centuries. The legends that grew up around the Templars served psychological and political functions that had little to do with historical reality. During periods of political oppression, the Templars became symbols of resistance to tyranny, innocent victims of corrupt authority who had been destroyed for defending truth and justice. During periods of religious reform, they became symbols of institutional corruption, examples of how noble ideals could be perverted by wealth and power. Brother Thomas de Chalon, standing among the stone effigies in the ruined temple church, understood that he was witnessing the birth of a myth that would outlive any historical reality. The actual experiences of Templar life, the grinding warfare, the psychological pressure, the constant fear of betrayal, the crushing weight of impossible vows, would be forgotten. What would survive was an idealized image of perfect knights, serving a perfect cause, martyred by evil men who feared their virtue. This mythological transformation was already beginning during Thomas's lifetime. Popular songs about the Templars portrayed them as innocent victims of royal greed rather than complex human beings who had been caught between impossible choices. Religious writers described them as martyrs for the faith rather than confused and broken men who had confessed to crimes they may or may not have committed. Political theorists used their example to argue for various reforms without examining the actual reasons for their destruction. The Protestant Reformation found the Templar story particularly useful as an example of Catholic corruption and papal tyranny. Martin Luther and other reformers pointed to the trials as evidence that the Roman Church had become so corrupt that it would destroy even its most faithful servants if they threatened its worldly interests. This interpretation ignored the role of secular authorities in the persecution, but it served the reformers' broader argument about the need for religious change. The Enlightenment transformed the Templars into symbols of reason and progress, destroyed by superstition and fanaticism. Voltaire and other philosophers used the trials as examples of the irrationality of medieval justice and the need for legal reform. They portrayed the Templars as proto-rationalists who had been destroyed for questioning religious orthodoxy, an interpretation that had little basis in historical evidence but served contemporary political purposes. The Romantic movement of the 19th century created perhaps the most enduring version of the Templar myth, transforming them into perfect medieval knights whose pure devotion to God and justice had been corrupted by an evil world. This romanticized image influenced everything from historical novels to architectural revivals to fraternal organizations that claimed Templar heritage. Each generation recreated the Templars in its own image, using their story to illustrate contemporary concerns about power, corruption, loyalty, and betrayal. The historical reality of Templar life became increasingly irrelevant compared to the symbolic uses their memory could serve. Modern conspiracy theories represent the latest evolution of the Templar myth. Their mysterious disappearance, their rumored wealth, their reputation for secrecy have made them perfect subjects for speculation about hidden powers that continue to influence world events. These theories typically ignore the well-documented historical evidence about their destruction while focusing on gaps in the record that can be filled with dramatic speculation. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Templars is what their story reveals about the relationship between idealism and power, between individual conscience and institutional loyalty, between spiritual aspiration and worldly reality. Men who joined the order seeking to serve God and protect the innocent found themselves trapped in an organization that demanded absolute obedience while operating in a world where absolute principles led to impossible choices. Their experience illuminates eternal human questions about how to maintain personal integrity while serving collective purposes, how to distinguish between legitimate authority and corrupt power, how to balance loyalty to ideals with loyalty to institutions, how to respond when the causes we serve betray the values they claim to represent. Brother Thomas de Chalon, as he prepared to leave the ruined temple church for the last time, understood that these questions would outlive both the order that had struggled with them and the kingdom that had destroyed it. The Templars had learned too late that good intentions were not sufficient protection against evil outcomes, that pure motives could lead to corrupt actions, that serving God faithfully was no guarantee of earthly justice. Yet their struggle with these questions, however flawed and ultimately unsuccessful, had added something permanent to human understanding of the costs and benefits of idealistic commitment. Future generations would face similar choices and would be marginally better equipped to navigate them because of the Templar example. As Thomas walked away from the carved knights who would pray in stone long after the last living Templar had been forgotten, he carried with him the knowledge that their true legacy was not in the buildings they had constructed or the battles they had won, but in the questions they had raised about what it means to live as fallen beings in a fallen world while striving to serve perfect ideals. The Templars were gone, but the problems they had faced and failed to solve remained. Their ghost would haunt every future attempt to build institutions that served higher purposes while operating in a world where power mattered more than principle, where survival required compromises that corrupted the very values that made survival worthwhile. In the end, the Knights Templar left behind the most valuable legacy possible, a clear example of both the nobility and the futility of human attempts to serve divine purposes through earthly means. Their failure was complete, but it was also instructive. They had shown future generations what was possible and what was not, what could be attempted and what must be avoided, what prices idealism demanded, and whether those prices were worth paying. Their legacy was written not in gold or stone, but in the hard-won wisdom that some truths can only be learned through bitter experience, that some prices can only be counted after they have been paid, that some failures teach more than any success ever could. And so we come to the end of our journey through the shadows of Templar history, dear listener. We have walked with these warrior monks through their sacred oaths and secret rituals, followed them into endless battles fought for an ungrateful world, witnessed their growing paranoia as enemies closed in from all sides, and watched helplessly as their own virtues were turned into weapons against them. The Knights Templar believed they were serving God, but they discovered they were serving men who had forgotten what God required. They thought they were building something eternal, but they learned that even the most sacred institutions could be destroyed by those who valued gold more than honor, power more than truth, convenience more than justice. Their story reminds us that the greatest dangers often come not from enemies who oppose our values, but from allies who claim to share them while secretly working to destroy them. The Templars were not defeated by Islamic armies or heretical movements, but by Christian kings and church officials who understood that the order's greatest strength, their unwavering loyalty to their cause, could be transformed into their greatest weakness. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you will dream of those stone-faced knights kneeling in their ruined churches, their carved features serene in the knowledge that some truths outlive the men who discover them, that some questions matter more than their answers, that some failures teach lessons that no success ever could. The Templars are gone, but their ghosts still walk among us whenever we face the choice between compromise and integrity, between survival and principle, between serving earthly powers and remaining true to higher ideals. Their whispered warnings echo through the corridors of every institution that claims to serve God while accommodating the appetites of men. May their sacrifice illuminate the path ahead for those who come after, and may their suffering remind us that the price of idealism is always higher than we expect to pay, but sometimes worth paying nonetheless. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of one of history's darkest chapters. If these tales of ancient mysteries have spoken to something in your soul, I encourage you to subscribe to our journey and share these stories with others who appreciate the complex truths that hide in history's shadows. Until next time, sleep well and remember, the past is never truly past. It lives on in the choices we make, the values we embrace, and the prices we are willing to pay for the things we believe truly matter. Good night, and may your dreams be touched by the wisdom that only comes from understanding how much the human spirit can endure, and how much it costs to serve something greater than ourselves. Sweet dreams.